We as leaders can recognize that if we get those values and behaviors aligned, we get a sense of making sure people feel they have autonomy, they feel aligned. They feel they have accountability, not in a bad way, but they feel like they're working in teams and they got each other's back with real relationships. And that's how we've seen the most adaptable teams actually be able to adapt and progress in this very rapidly changing world.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to BetterWorks podcast, People Fundamentals. I'm your host, Alex Lerald, Senior Director of Corporate Marketing. BetterWorks' core belief in people fundamentals revolves around enabling everyone in the workforce to strive for excellence, to foster creativity, and to acknowledge each individual's contributions. BetterWorks translates these beliefs into business fundamentals through strategic HR leadership. And in this show, we're diving even deeper into these principles as we hear from the experts about how you can make them come alive in your organization. And in this episode, adapted from a keynote that took place during BetterWorks 2023 Empower HR Summit, we hear from Jen Lim. Jen is the best-selling author of the book Beyond Happiness: How Authentic Leaders Prioritize Purpose and People for Growth and Impact. She's also the CEO of Delivering Happiness. Originating as an offshoot of Zappos, Delivering Happiness is a company co-created by her and Tony Hsieh that helps organizations create a culture of happiness with their products and services. And today, she joins us to share the story and delve into the essential elements required to construct a revolutionary and empathetic culture within your organization. The focus? Transforming work, enhancing experiences, and achieving greatness by prioritizing personal development. Jen dives deep into the transformative landscape post-2020, or as she calls it, 2020 BC, as in the demarcation between the before COVID and after COVID times. With a future-focused mindset, we're not just hearing about the challenges, we're uncovering the keys to lasting change in the face of unprecedented disruptions. She unravels a pivotal moment from when she wrote her book, which involves insights from Norman Cousins, Tupac, and Buddha. We'll hear about what all three have in common. And from this, she outlines the greenhouse model, a framework that's not just about adapting, but flourishing. She also discusses how sequoia trees can serve as a vivid metaphor for systemic changes in organizational structures, especially in the world of DEIB, where interconnectivity is paramount. So listen in as she discusses prioritizing well-being, fostering a me-we community, and embracing the greenhouse model for adaptable teams. And of course, hear how you can foster a radical, empathetic journey at your organization. Jen begins by unfolding a narrative encompassing the challenges that we faced since 2020 or 2020 BC. She discusses insights into the rapid pace of change and its impact on the workforce since then. As we navigate this retrospective journey, Jen hints at the need for leaders to adapt and make lasting changes, and she'll elaborate later on how to accomplish this.
How I love to start this off is the simple question: where were you in 2020 BC? And of course, I don't mean that in biblical terms. I mean that before COVID. What's crazy about to happen in 2020 BC is that, futurists actually predicted all these different things of pandemic, recession, climate change, social inequality, disruptive technology, so on and so forth. But what they did not predict is that it was going to happen in the same freaking year. So with that, it was just a huge reminder that the whole world it can just actually close down at one time. And with that, it actually gave us a bigger reminder of how the rate of change and complexity was already going fast. But with that, it's actually increasing our inability as human beings to actually understand it. And just to give you an example about the rate of change, like the good old telephone took 75 years to reach 50 million people. And if you're to guess what only took 19 days to reach the same amount of people, it was actually Pokemon Go. And then more recently, though, what took just 60 days to reach 100 million people, it was ChatGPT. So just indicators of how things are moving so quickly, and then therefore, what are we going to do as leaders in our own right to make adaptable change and make it stick?
Sharing her 2020 experience and the unexpected twists it brought, Jen emphasizes the gained wisdom amid challenges. The discussion sets the stage for exploring concepts like the Great Reset and its effects on work-life balance. She delves into the intricate layers of societal shifts and their implications on well-being.
I remember when 2020 came, clock hit midnight, and I was just so excited. I was like, oh my gosh, we're living in the future now. And then, of course, COVID came, and then I kind of got hit with other things like more gray hair and more wrinkles, so on and so forth. But one thing I think we did all gain is a bit of wisdom. So now, where are we with this great reset? Great, a lot of things, right? It's so interesting to see how that the work-life separation or balance is more integrated than ever. People are making hard choices. We've heard it all from every, new term that comes up every other week. Great resignation, great reset, great reshuffle, quiet quitting, quiet promoting. I can go on and on. What I think is interesting, though, is that it really was just amplifying all these things that were already there. Like, especially in this space, we've already heard about high turnover, disengagement, burnout, things about mental health. But I think with 2020, it just blew the hood open so that everyone could see and all was laid to bear. And finally, we're at a point where we can actually have a discussion about these things in more transparent ways. To the point where the Surgeon General actually launched this a few months ago and saying, look, mental health, basically they're putting like a warning label like on cigarettes, but they're putting it on workplaces, that this is impacting American people in these big ways as a factor of what it means to be working and how it really changes our health. So this one is a big one in terms of what's happening now, burnout. And this is the number one thing that's plaguing the global workforce, according to Gallup. And so what do we see? How does that happen when we have a huge workload, lack of control, lack of recognition, bad relationships? We don't feel like we're being fairly treated. And what's really interesting too, especially for this audience, is that when you have burnout is one thing, but as leaders in our space, we actually internalize other people's burnout as well. The difference between what happened in the Great Depression and all that stuff and now historically is that we have more wherewithal. We have more knowledge of what the difference is in being able to adapt. And that essentially is a function of both our mentality and our physical health. So even though this rate of adaptation and the rate of change is like growing exponential, we have at least more knowledge, at least more awareness and more tools to be able to say, if we can ground ourselves as human beings, as people at work, psychosomatically in our well-being, then we can actually weather and adapt to these changes better than before. What's really cool now, back in the day, even just, I would say 10, 15 years ago, 4-letter words like love and hate, we couldn't use too much in the workplace. But now we have this opportunity to be actually more respected by talking about these things and operating from both the head and the heart in a way that makes sense for people while being very empathetic to where they're at.
Transitioning into a more personal reflection, Jen shares a pivotal moment while writing her book, Beyond Happiness. Quoting Norman Cousins, Tupac, and Buddha, she introduces the concept of growth versus stress, setting the stage for a discussion on living fully beyond the confines of conventional happiness. She shares the philosophy encapsulated in the book.
I was writing this book, it was 2020, all these crazy things were happening, and I came across this quote, death is not the greatest loss in life, the greatest loss is what dies inside while we're still alive, by Norman Cousins. And as I was doing more research, I was realizing, wait a second, there was other people that were saying the same thing around the world. Tupac and Buddha said the same thing in their own words. And then I got super excited because I was like, I cannot wait to put a slide together so I can have Norman Cousins, Tupac, and Buddha all in one slide. But to me, it was the universality of all this. It's like we are connected human beings, and how we are is one example of this. When you think about one of your highs, when you think about one of your lows, and you think about what is the outcome of that, because it really is about the reaction. Everyone has all these things that comes out to that they have to overcome or deal with. What is our reaction? So the difference is that if we can actually take it in as a form of growth versus a form of stress. It's not to say we can erase all this trauma and loss, but we can make the choice to reduce that kind of impact it has on us for the rest of our lives. And then it actually empowers us, knowing when we look back at those lows that we had in the past and we hit another one in our future, at least we know ourselves, not through some inspirational quote, not through some self-help book, but through our own experience, how to get through it and to the next high. And that's how I came to Beyond Happiness, in the sense of not just rainbows and unicorns, is how we live fully. Because if you think about it, from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep, it's just not realistic to be happy the whole time. But you can live fully, and you can live with those highs and lows in a way that it carries over and forward to a more meaningful life. So by being real and by embracing our whole selves and really creating the environment for people to have, I know you've heard this term over and over again, psychological safety is like the number one thing right now, where people can be themselves in their strengths and shadows, in their bright and blind spots, and be able to create that environment where people can actually understand with psychological safety that as leaders, we naturally want to help others. And one thing that was missing from the equation, because Tony and I used to talk about being greenhouse leaders, like creating the conditions so people can grow, which was totally on point. But what was missing from that equation is how much we have to nurture our own greenhouse so that we can grow them better for others.
Jen introduces the greenhouse model, a framework for creating adaptable teams and fostering personal growth. The focus shifts to the foundational elements of values and behaviors, highlighting their significance in creating a workplace that thrives amidst change. She discusses exploring higher purpose and its role in aligning personal, team, and organizational objectives.
So I'm going to go over some of the nuts and bolts of what I share in the book, and the greenhouse model is what I call it. And so there's the pyramid of what, the circles of who, and together they make up the how. So on the base of the pyramid is values and behaviors. And I have an example of some values there for a company. But essentially, like, what are your values? Great. A lot of companies have them, but what are your specific behaviors that are actually defined in black and white from those values? Are they lived daily? And of course, are they rewarded and recognized and incentivized? Because otherwise, then there is no sort of baseline as to how people like those values and behaviors to be lived on a day-to-day basis. So what happens when they're not in place? We've seen it time and time again. We heard it, remember back in the day of Enron, their number one value was integrity. That was a very different dictionary from the rest of the world. And then fast forward to now, where we had WeWork and we had Theranos. And what was so interesting about these companies is that they were so purpose-driven, yet somehow there was a values misalignment. So this is happening all around us in some form or another. But we as leaders can recognize that if we get those values and behaviors aligned, we get a sense of making sure people feel they have autonomy. They feel aligned. They feel they have accountability, not in a bad way, but they feel like they're working in teams and they got each other's back with real relationships. And that's how we've seen the most adaptable teams actually be able to adapt and progress in this very rapidly changing world. So next on the model is the higher purpose piece. And this one we hear more and more about, like, what is it? What is this purpose thing and how do we put it into play? The biggest factor that's happening now is that if we can define our purpose, not just from an organizational standpoint, but also from a team standpoint and the personal individual standpoint, create environments where we're actually asking people to define their purpose outside of work. It doesn't really matter, just as long as they get a sense of like, hey, I actually care about what I want and what my higher purpose might be. And when you get that alignment from a personal to the higher team and organization, that's when you see true alignment. And the great thing about purpose is that Great Place to Work last year said those people, companies that have purpose, 3 times more likely for higher retention. And when you have purpose, with all these changes around it, it's okay because we're better equipped to expect and embrace the changes that can happen in this very unpredictable world. So what are some quick examples of what purpose looks like when it's really working well? poster child of purpose. Of course, you all know this one, Patagonia. I love what the founder said a few months ago. He said, instead of going public, we're going purpose, and our main shareholder is Earth. And they've been so consistent in that, in their values and behaviors. Another great example, Airbnb. They were hit so hard during COVID, as we all know, couldn't travel, couldn't fly, yet they stuck to their guns of being grounded in, hey, we believe and we belong. And now they are, I think they had one of the most profitable quarters, and so well positioned to continue to adapt and thrive in this changing environment.
To better illustrate the concept of greenhouse conditions, Jen draws a parallel with the interconnected root structure of sequoia trees. This metaphor serves as a foundation for exploring the conditions necessary for personal and collective growth. Through this, she talks about fostering a workplace environment that supports flourishing individuals and adaptable teams.
So moving to the middle of the pyramid, there's the greenhouse conditions, and it goes more in detail in the book, but I think the best sort of metaphor I have to describe this is like, what are the conditions to create others to grow in your greenhouse? And so I love talking about nature because I've learned so much from it. Sequoias, I don't know if y'all have been, Northern California, that's where I'm from. If you walked around this, like it is majestic place of trees, tallest in the world. But what's so interesting is that they have the shortest root structure of all the trees. And the reason why they're able to actually adapt and thrive is because the root structure is all interconnected underneath. And they even did experiments. The scientists were putting dye, like a colored dye, in one end of the forest to see where dye would go. And a few years later, they found that colored dye on the other end of the forest. My hope is that it was organic dye, because that would really suck for the trees. But point being, because each of these trees stand on their own with their own DNA, but because they're so interconnected with this sense of having a shared higher purpose and a sense of belonging, they are able to adapt and thrive.
Jen emphasizes the significance of starting with the individual, fostering psychological safety, and embracing the spectrum of well-being.
So going over to the who, and this one is the me-we community model. Simply that these three things are really what interconnects us all. And what we believe, or what I believe, is that we start with the me. And this one's super important, because if you think about everyone in your organization, how can we start with the me? Asking this question, are you okay? I think LinkedIn started using this and adding this into their employee surveys, and making sure you have that psychological safety. If you heard this study before, Google did a really cool study about what the most efficient teams are in their organization. And it wasn't about having the best software. It wasn't about having the best manager. It's called the Aristotle study. It was about having the most psychological safety in the teams. So this question is so important to share, not just with each other, but to ourselves. Because now more than ever, people need to know it's okay not to be okay. And therefore, like, how do we actually interact in that? By painting this picture that this is a spectrum. We can be flourishing on one end, or we can be languishing, kind of meh, maybe not necessarily depressed all the time, but not really fully energetically there. And being able to say that's okay. Because showing up doesn't mean we're just like full throttle every day. That's just not how it works. And being understanding that what it actually means is some days we'll have great days and some days we won't. And how can we actually embrace that in a way that is, taking all the negativity out of quiet quitting or bare minimum Mondays, but really treating people from a positive side of their whole self, their whole authentic self. So it's not just well-being anymore, it's whole being. And how do we do that as leaders? I have this tool in our exercise in the book, but basically making sure that these tools that we're using, the data we're collecting, is not just asking about their skill set or their progress in their role, but asking their whole self, financially, emotionally, mentally, relationally, spiritually, or purposefully. All these things getting captured on a consistent basis can paint a really good picture as to how we have these conversations so that people feel like they're being heard and understood with psychological safety. So one thing I present is like thinking about, like, we know what it means to invest in, some sort of fund financially, why don't we invest in our own fund, the Me Greenhouse Fund? There's a lot of talk about self-care, self-compassion, self-development. This is the time that we can actually encourage it in a way that we know that once people found the value in it, because one person's massage is different from one's meditation or a walk in the park. The goal here is to encourage people to test what it is that really actually impacts them in a positive way. And then they will actually want to invest in that fund for themselves. And one thing about this is it's like such a big cycle. It's such a big process. It's not just like a one-hit wonder. We learn something, we forget it, we practice it again, and we forget it, and then we really learn it until it becomes, as we know, from behaviors to habits. And so the reminder here is for all these people that might be, whether they're aware of they're struggling or not, that it's okay. Even though it feels like we're just kind of going in circles, what actually is happening is this sort of spiral staircase going up with progress along the way. And there's a reminder of the difference of starting when we're ready or just starting today and being able to look back.
She discusses the significance of psychological safety and its role in fostering efficient teams. And she explores the systemic changes required in organizational structures to support these principles, particularly in DEIB.
The We Greenhouse is so important for us in the way we look at people, because we know they're not expenses. We know that they're assets. We have the data, best place to work, Glassdoor, best companies to work for, Fortune, consistently over the last 10, 15 years outperformed the S&P 500. So we know the data is there. So we can talk to any CFO and be able to say, look, we know this works. The one big thing about this, though, that's different from 2020 BC is this idea of how we can do it together and the sense of belonging. Because as we all know, it's really possible to feel alone even when we have people around us. So what might we do differently, especially with DEIB, and how do we go about it? So I think the biggest thing is to define it like happiness. I define it by having science behind it. It's about having a higher purpose, about being authentic. So I love this analogy for DEIB. Diversity is being asked to the dance. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Equity is having a turn to pick the DJ or play your own music. And belonging is just being able to dance however you want. So by defining exactly what we mean by it, then there is no gray area as to like what our initiatives are behind it. And then from an org design structural point of view, when you have the pieces that I shared earlier, the what, the who, and then the lens of DEIB going through every single process that we go through in our organization, whether it's from org structure to hiring and firing to benefits and perks. When we're talking about remote versus hybrid versus, how many days in and out, all this stuff is like, we don't know until we ask. So we listen attentively, and then we do what's best also for the organization. And because no one knows all the answers, all we can do is ask the right questions and listen with that psychological safety in place and keep on testing on what might work.
Jen talks about the concept of the community greenhouse, emphasizing a holistic approach that transcends individual needs and considers the collective well-being. By exploring the double return on investment, the traditional and the ripple of impact, she draws parallels to renowned purpose-driven organizations like Patagonia and Airbnb, underlining the interconnected nature of workplaces within our broader ecosystem.
The biggest premise of this is not just asking, what's in it for me? It's asking, what's in it for all as well. So that any question that we have that's being presented to us, if we ask and answer the me and for all, we know inherently that we were being considerate of not just like your own individual needs, but what's it also in for the team or the organization. And by doing this, what we've seen is this end effect of what I call the double ROI. So the traditional return on investment, and then the other ROI is the ripple of impact. And this ripple of impact is essentially if you have like a Patagonia or the Airbnb, when you have these people within your team's organization that are individually living out their purpose, then you know that ripples out to the team's purpose, and then it ripples out to the organizational purpose. And this now more than ever is what this interconnection to not just the organization, but truly to our ecosystem. Everything we touch, all our customers, suppliers, vendors, even the earth itself, even society itself, there's so much interconnection going on. And what I love, again, I'm really inspired by nature. If you're a fan of Sir David Attenborough, if you've watched any nature shows on Netflix, or if you're a fan of, I don't know, marijuana or something, I'm sure you've heard his voice before. But basically, he's 90-something years old, and he's done his life's work on being able to say, look, the most biodiverse environments where you have the most flora, the most fauna in those ecosystems are the most sustainable, most resourceful, resilient, and adaptable. And isn't that the most ideal environment for us as workplaces? So just thinking about if we can make sure that diversity is there within our environments, we will have all these different outcomes that we all desire to make sure that we adapt and sustain.
Jen teaches us how to contemplate applying these concepts within our personal and professional spheres by encouraging a profound examination of what it truly means to live fully amidst life's highs and lows. She challenges us to envision the world we want to inhabit and echoes the sentiment of creating workplaces that foster authenticity, alignment, and belonging.
Thinking through all these different concepts of what your greenhouse could be within yourself and for your teams and your companies. If you think about what it truly means to live fully in your highs and your lows, and how the pieces of this model might be applied to where you are right now for this incremental change, I ask you to frame it like this. Like, what's the world you want to live in? Just take a moment to think about. What I've heard consistently is that I want a place where I could, be my best, where my people could be my best and grow. I want to be feeling authentic. I want to feel like I'm aligned. I feel a sense of belonging. I want to spend less time worrying, having more meaning in my life, in my days. By answering that question, sometimes it gets so heady and seems like it's such an impossible task, but I just love this Rumi-inspired quote. Just remember, you're not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop, in how we are just so interconnected. So as reminders, be the leader of your work life. Encourage your people to be so as well. Ripple your impact from there. Be the archaeologist and the architect. Look and reflect and then design how you want your life to be lived on a day-to-day basis. So that ultimately your legacy, when we think about legacy, I feel it's about living it in the now, not later and not looking back after it's too late.
As we traverse the challenges that we faced since 2020, there's an urgency for leaders not just to adapt, but to create lasting changes. Here are 3 key takeaways to apply in your organization. First, prioritize individual well-being. Initiate regular check-ins, asking a fundamental question. Are you okay? This fosters psychological safety, opening avenues for authentic discussions about well-being. Encourage individuals to invest in their well-being, cultivating a culture where employees explore and invest in what positively impacts them. Second, cultivate a me-we community. Foster psychological safety within teams, recognizing the impact of individuals flourishing on team efficiency and overall organizational adaptability. Integrate DEIB positively into every aspect of organizational processes, creating a workplace where everyone feels they belong and fostering adaptability and resilience. Lastly, adopt the greenhouse model for adaptable teams. Align values and behaviors with organizational goals, ensuring consistency and recognition. This foundational step contributes to autonomy, accountability, and strong team relationships. Align personal and organizational purposes, ensuring a shared sense of direction. Purpose-driven organizations exhibit higher retention rates and resilience in the face of change. Create conditions for personal and collective growth, drawing inspiration from nature's interconnectedness and contributing to adaptability and resilience within teams and the organization. By applying these takeaways, you empower your organization to navigate change and thrive in the interconnected ecosystem of work, like a sequoia. As you envision the world you want to live in, remember that leadership starts with fostering authentic and aligned environments where individuals and teams flourish amidst life's highs and lows. Let these principles guide your journey toward creating workplaces that not only adapt, but actively contribute to a legacy of positive impact and create a radical, empathetic culture. Be sure to stay tuned for our next episode of the People Fundamentals podcast. We're hearing from Radical co-founder and CEO Dan Riley about finding comfort in turbulent times and how developing a strong team with a meaningful culture can help us better navigate change. Subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google to find out what's in store. And if you like what you hear, share us with your friends and colleagues. We'll see you again soon.